Before breakfast ended, everyone at that table believed I was a thief. Everyone except the purple receipt sitting under my plate. Dana said it the way you'd read off a weather report. $11,600. Gone from the library fund. A deposit pouch found in my locked garage. A torn receipt stub beside it, in what she called my handwriting. My sister set down her fork and wouldn't look at me. 40 years I ran a print shop, and my own family made up its mind in under a minute that I'd robbed a flood-ruined library. I didn't argue. I slid the little purple slip out from under my plate and bent it between two fingers. My batch always tore on the left. Every book. Every time. This one tore from the right. Someone had printed a second set, and they had wanted me to find it. So I asked each donor to keep their receipt. Dana called that guilt and had me taken off the committee. But two of those donors were holding the same number. 084, printed twice. At least one full set of those records was a forgery, and Dana had laughed at my eye for detail for years. Let me go back to the beginning, because the order is the whole story. The breakfast was in the fellowship hall behind the Cedar Street Church, 3 blocks uphill from the branch we were trying to save. In November, the river had come up over its banks and stood 4 feet deep in the children's section for 2 days. When the water finally pulled back, it left the picture books swollen into bricks and a smell in the carpet that no fan could move. The whole neighborhood decided more or less at once that we were not going to let the place die. That was how the fundraiser started. Baked tables, a raffle, envelopes of cash from people who didn't have much to spare, and a little card reader for the ones who wanted to give from their phones. I kept the receipts. That was my one job, and I'd asked for it. When you've run a print shop for 40 years, a receipt book isn't paperwork. It's a promise on carbonless stock, 1 copy for the donor, 1 copy that stays. I'd printed the fundraiser's books myself. In the purple the committee voted for because purple photographs well on a flyer. 9 books. 90 receipts to a book. I could have told you the batch number in my sleep. That Saturday I came in early and set out the coffee. Ruth, my younger sister, was folding napkins at the end of the long table. Dana arrived last, which wasn't like her, carrying a canvas deposit pouch I recognized as one of ours from the supply closet. She didn't sit down. She waited until the hall was full and the talking had settled. And then she said, in a clear and careful voice, that there was a problem with the money. $11,600. That was the figure. She said it twice. She said the committee had reconciled the digital gifts against the cash deposits and come up short, and that when she went looking, she'd found this. She lifted the pouch in the back of my locked garage, behind the paint cans, along with a receipt stub torn from one of the books. The hall went very quiet. Somebody's spoon touched the side of a cup and stopped. I want to be fair to the people in that room because most of them loved me. But a canvas pouch in a mother's garage is a hard thing to argue with when it's being held up in front of you. Ruth looked at the pouch, and then she looked at the table, and I watched something close behind her eyes that I'd known my whole life. My own sister believed it. Not because she wanted to, because it was easier to believe the pouch than to believe her sister was being framed at a church breakfast. If you've ever stayed quiet because the truth needed a little more time than the room was willing to give it, I'd like to hear about it in the comments before this is over. I wasn't giving up that morning. I was deciding to let the paper speak first, because the paper doesn't get flustered and it doesn't take sides. Here's what nobody at that table watched me do. When Dana set my plate down in front of me, she'd plated the eggs herself. A small kindness I would think about for weeks afterward. There was a receipt tucked half under the rim. Purple. One of ours, or meant to look like one of ours. I thought at first it had slid off the side table by accident. Then I picked it up. Paper has a grain, the way wood does. A receipt torn along its perforation comes away clean in one direction and ragged in the other, and the direction isn't a mood. It's set when the book is bound, and it doesn't wander from one page to the next. Every book I'd printed for that fundraiser was perforated on the left. I'd bound them. I'd run my thumb down 90 of those seams for each of 9 books, checking. The slip under my plate tore from the right. I sat there with the eggs going cold and the room deciding what I was, and I turned that small square of paper over twice, and the only clear thought I had wasn't I have to defend myself. It was, there is a second book. Somebody made a second book, in my color, on my stock, and set a page of it under my plate, where I, of all the people in this hall, would be the one to feel that it was wrong. I put it in my cardigan pocket. I didn't say a word about it. The breakfast broke apart the way these things do, without anyone calling it. Chairs scraped. People found reasons to be near the door. Nobody accused me out loud a second time, which was almost worse, because it meant the first time had been enough. I stayed in my chair a while with my hand over the pocket of my cardigan. Then I got up and did the only thing I could think of that wasn't talking. I started clearing cups. And as I moved down the table, I said the same small sentence to each person I passed. Hold on to your receipt. Don't throw it out. Put it somewhere safe. I said it lightly, the way you'd remind someone to take an umbrella. A few nodded. A few looked at me like the asking itself was proof of something. I didn't explain. I couldn't have explained without saying the words second book out loud, and the second book was the only card I had. By the coffee urn, Sandra Pruitt and Bev Oshiro were standing together, both with their purple slips out, comparing the way people do, a little embarrassed. How much did you give? Oh, about the same. Their two receipts lay side by side on the folding table for 1 second, maybe two. Same number. 084. On both. Here's the thing about a receipt book that an honest count depends on. I'd numbered every slip in that fundraiser in one unbroken run. 1, 2, 3, straight through to 810. 90 to a book. 9 books. No restarts, no prefixes, no clever little codes. I did it that way for exactly this reason, though I never thought I'd need the reason. When the numbers run straight through, no two receipts in the whole fundraiser can ever wear the same one. You can look at the highest number issued and know, to the gift, how many came in. It's the plainest kind of honesty there is. It fits in a child's hand. 2 slips reading 084 could not both be mine. One of them was. The other had come out of a book I never printed, numbered to sit right on top of a real one, so that if you laid the false set over the true set, they'd match line for line. Same numbers. Same purple. Same 90 to a book. Only the tear and the grain would ever give it away. Somebody had built a mirror of my records. A whole second set, complete enough to carry a 084 of its own. I didn't point at the table. I didn't say, look at these two. I've thought a great deal since about why I stayed quiet. And it wasn't only strategy. It was that I already knew how the room would hear me. The woman they'd just watched get accused, suddenly pointing at paper, spinning a story about a second secret book, I'd have sounded exactly like a thief reaching for anything within reach. If I was ever going to be believed, it couldn't be because I said so. It had to be because the paper said so, out loud, in front of everyone, in a way that didn't need me at all. So I wrote 2 names in the little notebook I keep for grocery lists. The 2 women, 084, twice. And I kept clearing cups. Ruth found her coat and left without saying goodbye. That one I felt. We buried our parents together. We split one bad Christmas 50-50 for 30 years running so that neither of us would be alone on it. And she walked out of that hall with her chin down, like I'd taken something from all of us, and I let her go because a hallway was not where I was going to win her back. Paper or nothing. Dana watched me the whole time. Not the pouch she'd handed that to Frank Delgado, the committee treasurer, the second she'd made her point. She watched me. She watched me move down the table, saying, keep your receipt, and I saw her face change from the careful sorrow she'd worn all morning into something quicker and more awake. The way a person looks when a plan they thought was finished suddenly has a loose thread walking around the room, touching everyone's hands. That evening she called Frank. Then she called 2 other members of the committee. She did not call me. I found out what those calls were for on Monday. The committee met Monday nights in the back room of the hardware store on Pine, the one with the good long table, because Frank Delgado's family owned the place and nobody had to pay for the space. I'd sat at that table every Monday for months. When I came in that night, there was no chair for me. That was how they told me. Not with a speech. With arithmetic. 11 chairs for 11 people, and I made 12, and no one moved to find another. Frank stood up. Frank is a decent man who hates being looked at, and he'd plainly been picked to say it because saying it would cost him the most, which is a cruelty people mistake for fairness. He said the committee felt it would be best, given the questions about the accounts, if I stepped back from my role while things got sorted out. He used the phrase, stepped back twice, the way you'd pat a dog you were a little afraid of. Nobody said the word thief. They didn't have to. The empty place at the table said it in a language everyone in that room could read. Then Dana spoke. She was gentle about it, which was always her gift. She said she was worried. worried that I'd spent Saturday going around to donors telling them to hold on to their receipts, and didn't the committee think that was a strange thing for a person to do, unless that person was trying to get out ahead of account. She didn't accuse me of tampering. She wondered about it, out loud, with her hands open, and let the room do the accusing for her. I watched 11 faces decide that my one honest instinct, keep the paper. The paper is the truth, was the move of a guilty woman covering her tracks. I could have stood up and said it right then. 2 receipts, same number, a second book, I've seen it with my own eyes. I had the notebook in my purse with Sandra's name and Bev's name written in it. I didn't. And I want to be honest about the reason, because it wasn't all patience. Some of it was pride and some of it was fear. I was 69 years old and I just watched my own daughter turn a room against me with nothing but a soft voice and my own good habits. And I understood, sitting there with no chair, that I was never going to out-talk her. She was better at rooms than I would ever be. Rooms were her whole trade. But paper was mine. I called Ruth that night from the car, before I drove home, because I didn't trust myself to make it to the house first. It rang 4 times and went to her machine, she still keeps a real one, on the kitchen counter. I called again the next morning, and the morning after that. By Thursday I stopped leaving messages, because a woman leaving her 3rd unanswered message starts to sound, even to herself, like she's pleading, and I would not plead for something I hadn't done. My grandson Micah texted once, just, "Mom says give her space. Everybody needs to cool off." He's 19, and he loves me, and he was trying to help, and that little gray bubble on the screen was the loneliest thing I'd seen in years. Give her space. As though I were the one who'd swung something. I won't dress up that week for you. I made coffee I didn't drink. I sat in the garage, the same garage, the scene of the supposed crime, which not one of them had thought to actually search with me standing in it, and I looked at the spot behind the paint cans where a canvas pouch had supposedly lived for weeks without my ever seeing it. In a garage I keep locked. On a shelf I built with my own hands, and I felt the particular cold of being the last person to learn the shape of your own life. Then, on Friday, I did the thing that saved me. It wasn't brave. It was just what I knew how to do. I took out a legal pad, and I started a list of every donor I could remember, not to plead my case to them, to rebuild the record from the outside. Because here is what Dana, for all her gift with rooms, had never once bothered to learn about her mother's trade. Every genuine receipt from that fundraiser still existed. Not in my hands, not in the committee's box out there, in 90-odd purses and glove compartments and kitchen drawers across the neighborhood. The true set hadn't vanished. It had only scattered. And a scattered record is lost only to the person who doesn't know how to go door to door and gather it back, one purple slip at a time, until the second book has nowhere left to stand. I had 4 weeks until the next volunteer breakfast. That weekend I went looking for a tool I hadn't had a real reason to pick up in years. It was in a cigar box on the top shelf of the hall closet, wrapped in a chamois, my loop. A printer's loop, 10 power, the little folding kind you stand right down on the sheet and put your eye to. I carried one in my apron pocket every working day of my life. When I closed Price Printing, I let almost all of it go, and kept 2 things I couldn't: the loop and the press. Price Printing sat on South Ainsworth for 40 years. Business forms, church bulletins, wedding invitations, funeral programs, the numbered tickets for every raffle this town ever ran. People think printing is ink. It isn't. Ink is the easy part. Printing is alignment, getting a mark to land in the same place on the page 1,000 times running, so the second copy is the twin of the first, and not merely its cousin. That's the whole art. Sameness. On purpose. When I closed the shop 6 years back, I couldn't put the old Heidelberg on the auction truck with the rest of it. So it came home, into the garage, because a woman is allowed one unreasonable thing at the end of a working life. I ran little jobs on it now and again. And when the river took the library and the committee needed receipt books, I ran those too, the last real favor that press ever did. 9 books, in the purple they voted for. Off my machine, in my garage. Which is worth sitting with a moment. The pouch Dana held up at that breakfast was supposedly found behind the paint cans a few feet from the very press those receipts were born on. In a garage I keep locked. She had walked right past my life's work to plant a lie against it. Here's the small vanity of my trade I never told a soul, because who would care, that Heidelberg threw a registration mark. A tiny dot, down in the gutter margin where no eye ever travels. left by a pin that wore its seat loose sometime back in the 1980s, and that I never fixed, because by then the dot was how I knew my own work across a room. Every sheet off that press wore it, a freckle. The machine's fingerprint, in a spot you'd find only if you knew to lay a loop on it. Every genuine library receipt carried the freckle. If a second set existed and two slips reading 084 told me it did, it had come off some other machine. A good machine, maybe. One that could match my color, my stock, my numbering, my 90 to a book. But not my Heidelberg. Not my worn pin. Not my freckle. Whoever built the mirror couldn't copy a mark they'd never known was there. You can only forge what you can see. So that was my test. Grain and tear told me a slip was suspect. The freckle would tell me it was mine. I sat at the kitchen table a long while with the loop in my hand, and I'll tell you what surfaced, because it's the part I'm least proud of. Dana used to call the shop the paper church. She was 14 and she meant it as a blade. She'd come stand in the doorway after school while I was 40 minutes into a run, and I'd hold up one finger, 1 minute, baby, let me finish the register, and she'd watch me choose the sheet over her face, and she learned it the way children learn everything, in the body before the words. When she got married, I reprinted her programs at 2 in the morning because a single line of type had drifted a hair off true. I was so pleased with myself. I carried them to her the way a cat carries a bird. She looked at them and cried and said, "Nothing I make is ever finished enough for you, is it?" And I told her the first ones were sloppy, because they were. I was right about the programs, and I have been sorry about the sentence for 18 years. I won't pretend the woman who couldn't leave a crooked page alone was an easy one to be raised by. My precision was real, and so was the cold edge that rode along with it. That's my share of this, and I won't tuck it under the part where I'm the one who got wronged. But a hard mother and a thief are two different ledgers. Dana had folded the one into the other and handed the room the sum. She'd spent 30 years certain that my eye for detail was a kind of ailment, something small in me, something to apologize for at Thanksgiving. She'd built her whole trade on the opposite bet. Events, weddings, galas, ribbon cuttings, beautiful nights engineered down to the fold of the napkin and then gone by midnight, on purpose, leaving nothing behind that anyone could go back and check. She had wagered her life on the impression, and on the paper never mattering. She had picked the wrong mother to make that bet in front of. I wrapped the loop back in its chamois and slid it into my coat pocket, beside the grocery notebook with its two names. Sunday afternoon I drove out to the first house on the list. Sandra Pruitt's place, on the county road, wind chimes on the porch and a good old dog in the yard. She still had her receipt. She'd kept it, she said, because I asked her to. She had no idea she was handing me the first honest brick of a wall I meant to build one slip at a time. Sandra's was the first of 61 doors. I kept a map, not of streets, of numbers. A long sheet of butcher paper taped to my kitchen wall, one line for every receipt from 1 to 810, and as I found each slip out in the world, I filled in its line. Who held it? What they gave? Which way it tore? It was the same thing I'd done 10,000 times behind the counter, reconciling a run against its register, except now the shop was the whole neighborhood and I was working it backward, from the copies in. I'd made myself a rule before the first door, and I never broke it. I would not argue my case. I would not say Dana's name. I would not ask anyone to believe me. I would ask one thing only. May I take a picture of your receipt? Some doors didn't open. Word travels in a town like this, and there were houses where the curtain moved and nothing else did. Del Ferry, whose wife's funeral programs I'd printed myself, stood behind his screen door and told me he thought it'd be better if I went on home, Eleanor. He wasn't cruel about it. That was the thing that got me. He said it the way you speak to someone you're sorry for. I said thank you, Del, and I meant it, and I wrote nothing in his line, and I drove to the next house. But most doors opened. That's the part people who've never lived in a small place don't understand. Most of them let me in. Not because they decided I was innocent, most of them hadn't decided anything, which is its own kind of mercy, but because I'd printed their raffle tickets and their daughter's wedding invitations, and you don't slam a door on a woman like that even when you've heard she's a thief. They got out their receipts. I photographed each one flat on the table, in good light, with a dime beside it for scale, the way I used to photograph a job that had gone wrong to show a customer exactly where. And slowly, line by line, the wall filled in, and the pattern rose up out of it like a watermark you can only see when you tilt the page. Most of the slips tore left. Mine. The cash gifts, the checks, the envelopes, the money people handed across a table into a human hand. Every one of those. Left here, and when I set my loop down in the gutter margin, there in the corner sat the freckle. My press. My work. Honest paper. All of it. The right tear slips were fewer. Maybe 1 in 5. And they shared a thing that made the back of my neck go cold the first time I saw it plain. Every last one of them belonged to someone who'd given from their phone. Not cash. Not a check. The digital gifts, the ones you made by scanning the little square code printed in the corner of the receipt, the square the committee had added so a donor could pull up an acknowledgement letter for their taxes. All the phone gifts, and only the phone gifts, tore from the right. Not one of them wore the freckle. And every single one had been handed out at the same table. The table Dana ran. I didn't trust it at first. A pattern that clean can be a thing you've talked yourself into, and I'd promised to be harder on my own conclusions than the committee had been on me. So I went back out. I tracked down 3 more phone givers I'd missed, drove clear over to the fairground side of town for one of them, and laid their slips under the loop on their own kitchen tables. Right tier. No freckle. Every time. 61 doors. A wall of 810 lines, and the forgery hadn't fallen where a thief grabbing at cash would have scattered it. It fell in one tidy column, the phone gifts. The newest and least visible money there is. The kind that leaves no envelope and no handshake behind. Only a glowing screen and a slip most people push into a bag and forget. Nobody had robbed that fundraiser in a panic. Somebody had chosen, very carefully, the one kind of giving that nobody in a church basement knows how to check. And they'd sat at a table all day long handing out the proof of it, certain no one alive would ever gather it back up. I stood in my kitchen that night looking at the wall, and for the first time since the eggs went cold in front of me, I was not the one in the room who should have been afraid. It took 9 days to get back to Dana. I know, because that's when the phone calls I'd been making started running the other direction. A woman named Coralie Voss, whose receipt I'd photographed on a Tuesday, called me that Thursday, embarrassed, to say Dana had phoned her. Just checking in, Dana had said, making sure Mom hadn't upset her, going around like that with her little magnifying glass. Coralie repeated the phrase, because it had bothered her. Her little magnifying glass. Dana had a way of shrinking a thing just by naming it. I'd spent 40 years with that loop pulling other people's mistakes back from the brink, and in one sentence my own daughter had turned it into a prop. The sad hobby of a woman who couldn't accept what she'd done. That was the shape of it, and it spread the way she meant it to. She never once said I was lying. She said she was worried about me. She said it to the committee and to the church, and to 2 of my oldest friends, in that low, grieving voice, and worry is a clever weapon, because you can't fight it without looking like exactly the unraveling woman it describes. She came to the house herself on a Sunday. I saw her car from the window, and I had time to decide one thing, that I would not take the butcher paper down. Hide it, and I'd be admitting it was something to hide. So I left it up, 810 lines and all, and I put the kettle on, and I let her in. She stood in my kitchen and looked at that wall a long moment, and I watched her decide how to see it. She could have read it for exactly what it was. She's not stupid. My daughter has never once been stupid. But reading it right would have cost her too much, so she chose the cheaper story, the one she'd already been selling. Her face softened into pity. "Mom," she said, "what is all this?" I told her it was a reconciliation. She said, "Of what?" And I said, "Of the fundraiser," and I offered her tea. She didn't take it. She told me gently that people were talking, that I was frightening folks, showing up at their doors, that there was still a way for all of this to end quietly, if I'd just stop and let the committee handle the money, and come back to the family when I was ready to have a real conversation. Come back to the family. As though I'd been the one to leave. I said I'd think about it. I said nothing else, because everything else I knew was up on that wall behind her, and she'd chosen not to see it, and there's no use showing a thing to a person who has decided in advance not to look. She left her tea cooling on the counter and she went, and I watched her car until it turned at the corner, and then I sat down, because my legs had been holding more than I'd let on. 2 days later, Bev Oshiro handed me the piece I didn't yet know I needed. Bev was one of the 2 who'd stood at the coffee urn holding a 084. She'd let me photograph her slip weeks back. But that Tuesday she called me on her own, and she said something had been nagging at her. When she gave from her phone that day, she'd gotten one of those automatic thank you emails, and she'd just come across it again hunting for something else. And the funny thing, she said, was that it hadn't come from the library. It came from a name she didn't know. She read it off her screen to me. It wasn't the library fund. It wasn't the committee. It was a plain little business name, the kind that means nothing at all until it means everything. I wrote it in the grocery notebook. I told Bev to keep that email and not delete it for anything. I didn't tell her why. I still couldn't prove what it was. But a receipt that tears the wrong way is a question, and a thank you note from a stranger for money you meant to give your drowned library is a different question, and the two of them were beginning to lean toward each other across my kitchen table like they wanted to be introduced. That same week, on a night I was feeling the whole weight of it, I opened my front door for the mail and found a casserole on the step. Foil over a dish I knew, because it was mine. I'd sent it home full with Ruth, after a Sunday supper 2 winters back. No note. Still warm. My sister couldn't yet say she believed me, but she could drive across town in the dark and leave a hot dish and drive off without knocking, which is the oldest language our family has for I don't know how to be near you and I can't stand for you to be alone. I ate it standing at the counter, under the wall, and I'd like to tell you it didn't undo me, but it did. A little. The next morning Frank Delgado called. The committee would meet Thursday, he said. Dana had asked for the floor. She had something she wanted to put to rest. For good. I already knew I would go. You don't get to decide a thing about me in a room I was too afraid to walk into. The back room at Delgado's smelled of cut keys and machine oil, the way it always had, and this time there was a chair for me, set apart from the table, against the wall, like a chair outside a principal's office. Dana had thought of that too. She thought of everything that could be arranged. She'd brought a folder. She waited until Frank called the meeting to order, and then she stood and said she hated to do this. She truly did, but the fundraiser couldn't go forward with a cloud over it, and the people in this room deserved the truth even if it broke her heart to hand it to them. Then she opened the folder. The pouch came out first. The canvas deposit pouch, the same one she'd held up at the breakfast, that had lived since then in the committee's keeping. She set it on the table like an exhibit. Everyone had seen it before, but seeing a thing twice makes it heavier, not lighter, and I watched the room take it in again and settle deeper into what it already believed. Then she laid a single sheet of paper beside it. Handwritten. A column of figures dates down one side, amounts down the other, and at the bottom, underlined twice, $11,600. She said it had been in the pouch. In my garage. In my hand. I studied it from my chair against the wall. It wasn't my hand. I've crossed my sevens the same way since Eisenhower, and these sevens were bare, but it was close. Close enough. My daughter grew up watching me write, and she'd made her 4s and her 9s lean the way mine do. And to anyone in that room who wasn't me, it was a confession in the thief's own ink. Frank asked me, quietly, not unkindly, whether I wanted to say anything. And here is the moment I've gone over more than any other. Because I had all of it in the trunk of my car, 30 feet away. The photographs, the wall, rolled up, 810 lines. The loop. I could have carried it in and spread it on that table and started talking about grain and freckles and phone gifts. I looked around the room first. I made myself do it slowly. Frank, who wanted to believe me and couldn't afford to. Old friends who'd already grieved me. 11 people who'd spent a month hearing, in a soft and loving voice, that I was not well. And I understood that if I stood up in that room and started explaining that my own daughter had secretly printed a second receipt book and buried the theft inside the phone donations, I would sound exactly, precisely, like the woman she'd told them I was. The evidence wouldn't matter. They'd hear the pitch of it and not the proof. This was her room. It had always been her room. The donors weren't in it. The people who actually held the paper were scattered in kitchens all over the county, and that table couldn't see a one of them. So I did the hardest thing I did in the whole of it. I said, "No, Frank. I don't have anything to say tonight." And I let them ban me. They called it permanent. A motion, a second, a show of hands I didn't turn to watch. Removed from the library project, from the committee, from the thing I'd given my last good press run to, and it was done in under a minute, the way the Accusation had been done in under a minute, because that had become the speed at which my family did things to me. Dana was gracious about it. That was the part that told me the most. She didn't gloat. As people gathered their coats, she told the room, warmly, not to worry about the money, that she'd already started working with the payment company to see what could be recovered, and that one way or another she would personally make certain the library didn't lose a single dollar. People thanked her. My daughter stood in that room accepting gratitude for promising to return money she had taken, and she did it with wet eyes. And I understood then that she didn't only want the money, she wanted to be the one who saved the day. The theft was just the first act. She was building toward a scene where she walked in with the whole sum recovered, and the neighborhood loved her for it. Which meant there was a clock now. She'd move soon to close her own story on her own terms. I drove home banned. I did not cry, and I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the grocery notebook open to the little business name Bev had read me off her phone. I'd been waiting to be careful. I was done waiting. That night I took out my own phone, and I scanned one of the wrong receipts. Here is what happens when you scan a receipt at your own kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. The phone thinks for a second. Then it offers you a link, and the link opens a page, and the page tells you where your money actually went. I started with a wrong one. A right tear slip Bev had let me keep no freckle in the gutter, a phone gift. I held my phone over the little square code and let it read. A checkout page came up. Clean, modern, a green button, a logo, and across the top, the name of the business that would receive the payment. It wasn't the library. It wasn't the fundraiser. It was a name I knew as well as my own, because I'd printed its very first business cards at a discount 6 years ago, as a gift. Cedar and Sage Events. Dana's company. I sat there a while. I won't pretend I reasoned my way through it in that first minute because I didn't. In that first minute I was only a mother looking at her daughter's business name on a page that had been quietly taking money from people who thought they were saving a library. The kitchen was very quiet. The wall of 810 lines watched me from across the room. Then the printer in me took over, because the printer is steadier than the mother. I got out a genuine slip-left tear, freckle, a cash gift I'd written by hand that morning at the breakfast, and there was a code on that one too, the acknowledgement square the committee had wanted. I scanned it. A different page. The library's real fund, the one the committee had set up, the logo we'd all seen on the flyers, a line that read, "Your gift supports the Fernhill branch rebuild." 2 squares. Side by side on my table they looked identical. Same size, same purple. The same tidy little grid of black cells. To the eye, twins. So I did the one thing I can do that most people can't. I laid the loop down on them. Under 10 power, a code stops being a picture and becomes what it truly is, a grid, printed cell by a machine. And the 2 grids were not the same. Down in one corner, a handful of cells sat where they had no business sitting. Someone had taken the honest code, the one that pointed at the library, and altered it. Moved a few cells, so that the same innocent little square now pointed somewhere else entirely. Not enough for a human eye to catch. More than enough for a phone to obey. That was the whole trick, and it was a beautiful, ugly little thing. She hadn't stolen the money in. Every soul who gave from their phone that day held up their screen, scanned my daughter's altered square, and sent their gift straight into Cedar and Sage Events. Then walked off holding a purple receipt that looked exactly like an honest one, minus a freckle they'd never heard of. The cash shortage, the pouch, the sheet in a hand like mine, all of it was the magician's other hand. Something to keep the room staring at the cash and the garage and me, while the real money slipped out a door nobody thought to watch. And here's the thing that told me she'd never once been afraid of getting caught. She'd used her own company, her real processor, her real business name, right there on the page for anyone who scanned. A careful thief hides behind something numbered and blank. Dana hadn't bothered, because Dana had wagered her whole life that nobody checks the paper, that the detail is beneath notice, that her mother's loop was a joke. She'd built the theft on the certainty that small things don't count, and she'd signed it, without meaning to, in the one place she was sure no one would ever look. The money was still there. That mattered more than anything else I learned that night. Bev's gift, and all the others, hadn't been spent or moved. It sat in that account, whole, waiting because Dana wasn't finished. She meant to give it back. On her own day, in her own good light. The devoted daughter who chased down the missing funds and made the library whole while her poor confused mother looked on. The theft was never meant to end in a theft. It was meant to end in a homecoming, with Dana at the center of it. I closed the phone. I looked at the wall, and the 2 little squares, and the loop, and I understood that I finally had all of it. The tear, the freckle, the numbers, the codes, the account, the plan. And I understood one more thing, which stopped me cold. If I picked up that phone and called the police tonight, I'd be a banned, disgraced old woman making a wild accusation against the very person the whole town had just thanked for promising to fix everything. I'd be the story she had already written. There was only one room where the paper could speak for itself. One table, with the donors sitting around it, holding their own receipts in their own hands. The final volunteer breakfast was 11 days away. 11 days, and one decision, and the decision was the harder of the two. Because I'll be honest with you about what I wanted. I wanted to walk into that breakfast and say her name. I wanted to stand where she'd stood, and hold up the two little squares, and watch the room turn its face from her the way it had turned from me. I'm 69 years old, and I'd spent a month being called a thief by people whose christening cards I'd printed, and there's a part of anyone that wanted the loud, clean pleasure of pointing. I didn't do it. And I want to tell you why, because the why is the only thing in this whole story I'm truly proud of. If I stood up and accused her, I'd be asking that room to choose, her or me. My word against hers, mother against daughter, and rooms hate choosing between two people they know. They just decide the whole business is ugly and side with whoever makes the ugliness stop. I'd be handing them a fight. And a fight goes to whoever's better at fighting, and we already knew who that was. Paper doesn't fight. Paper just sits there and is true. So I decided I would say nothing at all. I would not accuse my daughter of one single thing. I would only give every person in that room the two halves of what they already half knew, and let them put it together with their own hands, at their own table, holding their own receipts. If I was right, I wouldn't have to say so. And if by some wild chance I was wrong, better to be proven wrong in quiet than to have screamed an accusation I couldn't stand behind. Either way, I'd keep my mouth shut and let the truth have the floor. It cost me something, giving up that pointing. I won't pretend it didn't. But a woman who spent her life making things land in the same place 1,000 times running ought to be able to trust one thing to land once, on its own, without her shouting it there. Then I built it, the way I'd build any careful job. I still had the record copies, all of them, the bound stays halves of every genuine receipt from that fundraiser, because keeping the record had been my one job, and no one had ever thought to take it back from the band woman. 9 books of honest purple, tear left, freckled, every one of them scanning home to the Fernhill Fund. Against those I set my photographs, the 810 lines, the wrong tier slips with their altered squares. And night after night, I began to pair them. For every number, 2 truths. The honest copy I'd kept, and its crooked twin, out there in somebody's purse. I matched them up, number to number, and beside each pair I typed a plain little card, no bigger than the receipt itself. It accused no one. It said only this: here is a receipt with the same number as yours. Set them side by side. Then scan the code on each, and see where your gift went. That was all. A line of instruction and 2 pieces of paper, and the whole month of my disgrace folded up small enough to slip under a plate. The trouble was the door. I was banned, and the breakfast was Dana's now, and a barred woman doesn't get to walk in early and lay something under every setting. So I went to Ruth. I didn't call first. I drove to her house on a Wednesday and stood on the step where I'd once found a casserole, and when she opened the door, I didn't ask her to believe me. I asked her to look. I set 2 purple slips on her kitchen counter, both reading 217, and I handed her my phone and said, "Scan them. Just scan them, Ruthie. You don't have to say a single word to me after." She scanned the first, the library. She scanned the second, a green button, and a business name the 2 of us had watched Dana paint on a window over on 6th Avenue 3 summers back. My sister stood in her own kitchen and went white and set the phone down very gently, the way you'd set down something that had turned hot in your hand. She didn't say she believed me. She's as stubborn as I am, it's the family curse. What she said was, "I'm on setup Saturday. I've got the key. Come at 6. Before anybody." That was all either of us could manage. And it was enough. It was, I think, the most my sister had ever risked for me, and she did it without once admitting out loud that she'd been wrong, and I loved her so much in that moment. I had to go sit in my car a while before I trusted myself to drive. Ruth let me in before the light, and for 2 hours we set those 140 places the way our mother taught us, both forks on the left, and under each white plate, where the rim would hide it, a small purple pear, and a typed card. We didn't talk much. Once, halfway down the 3rd table, Ruth stopped with a plate in her hand and said, quietly, not looking at me, "If you're wrong about this, it's the end of you." And I said, "I know." And she set the plate down over the paper and moved to the next one. That was the closest either of us came to naming what we were doing. Two sisters in an empty hall, hiding the truth under the crockery, the morning light coming in gray and then gold through the high windows, a purple slip waiting under every plate like a card that hadn't yet been dealt. Then we opened the doors and the neighborhood came in. I took a chair at the very back, by the coat rack, where a band woman belongs. I decided I would not say one word, and I held to it, though holding to it turned out to be the hardest sitting still I have ever done. Dana was up front in a blazer the color of good news, moving table to table, touching shoulders, and I understood from the shine on her that today was meant to be her day too. She had a folder again. She meant to stand up over the eggs and the coffee and announce that she'd recovered the library's money, that the missing $11,600 had been found and returned, and the fund was whole. She was going to be the hero this morning. She'd built the whole month toward it. She just didn't know that every plate in the room was already set against her. It started slow, the way these things do. A man at the second table lifted his plate to reach the jam and found the paper under it. He read the card. He looked puzzled, then mildly amused, and he took his own purple slip out of his shirt pocket, the way the card asked, because people will do a small strange thing if you ask them politely on a card. He laid the two side by side. Same number. He tilted his head. Then he did the last thing the card asked. He scanned them both with his phone. I watched his face when the second page came up. I have printed a great many things in my life, and I have never once printed anything that did to a man's face what that green checkout page did to his. He showed the woman beside him. She got out her own receipt. Down the table it went, plate lifting after plate, that little purple flash under each one, phones coming out, the murmur climbing. Somebody said cedar and sage out loud, puzzled, and then somebody else said it not puzzled at all. Bev Oshiro found the honest twin of her own 084 sitting under her plate tear left, where hers tore right, and she pressed her hand flat over her mouth. Sandra Pruitt was already crying, quietly, the way you cry when a thing you didn't want to believe turns out to have been true the whole while. Dana felt the room change beneath her before she understood it. She always could read a room. That was her gift. She tapped her glass for the floor, to get out ahead of whatever this was. And she started into her speech. She actually began it. I'm so pleased to tell you all that thanks to a great deal of work behind the scenes, and the words just came apart in the air, because nobody was looking at her. 140 people were looking down at two little slips of purple paper, scanning, comparing, turning to their neighbors, and the name on every screen was the name painted on her own shop window. She said, "There's been some kind of mistake." She said it twice. The second time her voice climbed at the end, and I heard in it the exact pitch she had spent a month telling everyone was mine. Frank Delgado rose slowly at the head table, his phone in one hand and his receipt in the other, and he did not raise his voice. He just said, "Dana." And then he said, "Scan yours. Scan the code on yours, honey, and show us it goes to the library." And she couldn't. She stood there in her blazer the color of good news, with her folder full of her grand recovered money speech, and she could not pick up her phone and scan a code in front of the people she'd meant to be a hero to. And the not doing it was louder than any confession she could have made. Nobody was whispering about me anymore. I sat in my chair by the coats, and I did not stand, and I did not point, and I did not say her name. I didn't have to. The paper was in 140 hands, and it was doing the only thing I'd ever asked of it. It was sitting there, being true, in front of everyone at once. Dana turned then, searching the room for the one face that might explain to her what was happening. She found me at the back. And for the first time in a month, my daughter and I looked at each other across a room, and both of us knew, exactly, the very same thing. The money came back within the week, and it came back the dull, ordinary way that real justice usually arrives, not with handcuffs at the door, but with a phone call from a payment company and a form somebody had to fill out in triplicate, because Dana had never moved it. It sat whole in the Cedar and Sage account, waiting on her big morning, and that was the one mercy in the whole business. She'd been so sure of her ending that she left the evidence liquid. Frank Delgado, still the treasurer and now the most careful man in Pierce County, carried the donors' scans and the matched receipts and my photographs to the payment company, and they did what those companies do when a whole room can document that their gifts landed in the wrong account. They froze it. They reversed it. $11,600 went home to the Fern Hill Fund, every dollar of it. The very sum she'd blamed on a cash shortage that had never existed sitting the whole time in an account with her own name on the door. The committee met that next Thursday. I wasn't there, I was still officially banned, and I didn't ask them to rush the paperwork on my account. But Frank called me after and told me they'd voted to remove Dana from the project. He was quiet on the phone. He said, "We owe you a different vote too, Eleanor, and I mean to bring it to the floor." I told him there was no rush, which surprised him, and surprised me a little as well. I found I didn't need the room to hand me back the chair. I'd stopped measuring myself by whether that table had a seat for me somewhere around the second week of knocking on doors. They didn't arrest her. I want to be honest about that, because people always want the story to end with a cell door, and this one didn't. There was talk of it. The company filed what it had to file, and there are people looking at it still, and it may yet go somewhere. But the neighborhood, in the end, wanted its library back more than it wanted a Price girl in the county paper, and I understood that, and I didn't push for more. What I wanted was never her ruin. It was the truth, standing up on its own where everyone could see it. I had that now. The rest wasn't mine to go hungry for. I did learn the why of it, eventually, in pieces. Cedar and Sage had been drowning 2 seasons of weddings that fell through. A lease she couldn't carry. The beautiful vanishing business she'd bet her whole life on quietly coming apart in her hands. She'd meant to borrow the library's money, the way a certain kind of desperate person tells herself she's only borrowing, and hold it a few weeks, and put it back with a flourish that made her look like a savior instead of a woman going under. She never planned for the fund to lose a dime. She planned to be thanked. That was the shape of my daughter's crime, and there's a version of me that could almost hold it with tenderness if she'd taken it from anyone but the drowned library, and framed anyone but her own mother to buy herself the time. The family came around slowly, and then all at once, the way the breakfast had. Micah showed up at my door first, 19 and stricken, and this time he didn't say, "Give her space." He said, "Grandma, I'm so sorry." I believed her, and I held my grandson in the doorway while he cried over a thing that was never his fault, because at 19 you don't yet know that the people who love you can be wrong about you, and it isn't the end of love. Ruth just started coming to Sunday supper again, and neither of us made a speech about it. And then, one by one, they began to ask me the thing I'd known all along they would ask. A cousin called it putting it behind us. One of Dana's aunts called it not throwing the girl away. Even Ruth gently, once, over the potatoes, wondered aloud whether there might be a way for the family to just heal and stop picking at it and let Thanksgiving be Thanksgiving again. They wanted me to come back to the table and act as though the plate had never had a receipt beneath it. As though the whole month had been a misunderstanding that everyone, most of all me, could agree to forget. They meant it kindly. That was the part that made it hard. Dana asked me too, in her own fashion. She called on a Tuesday night, and she didn't say she was sorry not once. In the entire call, did she say it plainly, but she asked, in a small voice I hadn't heard from her since she was a girl, whether we couldn't please just move on. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked at the wall where the butcher paper had hung, at the pale clean rectangle it had left on the plaster, and I knew that whatever I said next was going to decide the rest of my life. I told her no. Not cruelly. I've had a long while now to think about how you say a thing like that to your own child, and cruelty isn't it. I said, "Dana, I'm not going to hate you. I'm too old, and you're too much mine, for that. But I am not going to sit at a table and pretend it didn't happen, and I am never again going to be the one who makes your story smooth for you. If you want me in your life, you'll have me in a life where this is true out loud. That's the only version of your mother that's left." She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "That's not fair." And I said, "No." And I didn't add anything, because she was right that it wasn't fair, and she was wrong about which of us that was supposed to matter for, and there was nothing to say to either of those. That's where we are now. Not estranged, exactly. I see her. We were both in the same room at Micah's birthday, and the sky did not come down. But there's a door in me that used to stand always open to her, and I've learned to keep it on a latch. And she knows it's latched. And she knows why, and neither of us pretends the latch isn't there. That is what a boundary actually is, once you strip the word of all the softness people wrap around it. It's a door you're finally willing to keep shut, even against someone you love. Especially against someone you love. People want me to tell them I forgave her, or that I cut her off, because those are the two endings that fit on a bumper sticker. I did neither. I did the harder middle thing, the one nobody makes a movie about. I stayed her mother, and I stopped being her cover. They gave me back the library. Not just the committee, though the committee too. Frank brought his vote, and they made a small ceremony of it that I sat through mostly for his sake. But I mean the building. When the rebuild reached the children's section, the part the river had ruined worst, somebody had the sense to ask the retired printer whether she'd help set up the new reading room, and I said yes before he'd finished the question. I spent that spring among low shelves and tiny chairs, and on the morning it opened, I printed the dedication cards myself, on good stock, in a purple I chose without asking anyone's permission. I kept one. It's framed on my wall now, hung over the pale rectangle where the butcher paper used to be, in the spot I've never repainted, because I like the two of them there together the month I was called a thief, and the card that says the children's room is open. One press made both. The same freckle sits in the corner of each, if you know to look. That's the thing I'd leave you with, if you've stayed all this way with me. They told me my silence was a confession. For a whole month, the quiet I kept was read as guilt by every person I loved. But I was not surrendering in that silence. I was gathering. There's a kind of quiet that is given up, and there's a kind that is only waiting for the paper to be ready, and from the outside, right up until the last morning, the two of them look exactly the same. So let me ask you the thing I've been turning over myself. If it were your family, if it were your table, would you ever sit back down at it? I'd honestly like to know. Tell me down below, because I don't believe there's one right answer, and I've come to trust the people who sit with the hard version of the question. And if Eleanor's kind of quiet is a quiet you've ever had to keep, then stay a while. This is a place for the reckonings that don't shout, and there are more of them here than only mine. The library smells of new carpet and old paper now. On the shelf by the window, where the water once stood 4 feet deep, a child I have never met is turning pages, and not one of them is stuck to the next anymore.